Veiled Queens. History often teaches us to look for power where it is loud, in crowns, in parliaments, in titles etched into law. We are trained to recognize authority when it commands armies, signs decrees, or stands at the center of public attention. But some of the most decisive power in human history never operated that way at all. It did not sit on thrones. It did not pass legislation. It did not need to raise its voice. It existed quietly, almost politely, moving through invitations, seating charts, and the subtle, devastating force of social silence. It decided who belonged, who mattered, and who would never quite be allowed inside. In the late 19th century, at the height of America's Gilded Age, this kind of hidden authority shaped lives just as effectively as any law. New York overflowed with wealth. Fortunes were made faster than tradition could absorb them. Mansions rose along Fifth Avenue. Ballrooms glowed with gaslight and ambition. Everyone seemed rich, but not everyone was accepted, and acceptance was everything. At the center of this anxious, glittering world stood one woman who embodied that invisible power more completely than anyone else. She was not a queen. She held no political office. She never voted on a law or signed a decree. Yet her approval mattered more than money. Her silence could end a social career, and her invitation could transform a family's future. Her name was Caroline Astor. This is not simply a story about luxury or excess. It is a story about how power truly works when it does not need to explain itself. It is also a story about how women, excluded from formal authority, learn to rule through customs, rituals, and recognition. This is why stories like this belong on Veiled Queens. Because history does not only hide power in forgotten figures, it hides it in plain sight, behind manners, silence, and the quiet decisions that shaped entire social worlds. And in the Gilded Age, no one understood that better than Caroline Astor. Caroline Astor did not seize this power through ambition or spectacle. She inherited position, yes, but authority had to be cultivated, and she cultivated it with remarkable patience. In a society obsessed with novelty and display, she mastered something far more enduring: restraint. She belonged to what New York quietly referred to as old society, families whose wealth predated the industrial explosion, and whose sense of order rested on lineage, manners, and mutual recognition. This world did not advertise itself, it assumed itself, and Caroline Astor understood that assumption was its greatest defense. As new fortunes flooded the city, something curious happened. The very men who controlled railroads, factories, and banks found themselves uncertain in drawing rooms. They could purchase marble staircases and imported tapestries, but they could not purchase ease. They could build ballrooms, but they could not guarantee who would enter them. What they wanted, what they needed, was legitimacy.
Caroline Astor never openly offered it. She simply allowed people to notice where she stood. Her home became a reference point, not because it was the grandest, but because it was consistent. It represented continuity in a city that was changing too fast for comfort. To be seen there was to be anchored. To be absent was to remain adrift. Her gatherings followed rules that were never written down, yet universally understood. Who was invited? Who arrived early? Who was placed near whom? These were not trivial details. They were signals. And those signals were read with extraordinary care. An invitation from her was not an act of generosity. It was recognition. Once granted, that recognition carried consequences far beyond a single evening. Doors opened elsewhere. Names appeared more frequently in society columns. Conversations shifted. A family's status hardened into something durable. Social legitimacy, once conferred, tended to replicate itself. But exclusion was far more powerful. There was no announcement, no rejection letter, no explanation. One simply noticed, over time, that certain invitations never came, that certain introductions were never made, that certain social paths quietly ended before they began. And because nothing was said, there was nothing to challenge. This was Caroline Astor's genius. Her power operated best when it appeared natural, almost accidental. She did not enforce hierarchy, she revealed it. Society did the rest. Those who wished to rise studied her closely. They learned what pleased her, what unsettled her, what she tolerated, and what she did not. But she did not bend easily. New wealth alone did not impress her. Excessive display often worked against its owner. What mattered was discipline, social, cultural, behavioral. In this way, Caroline Astor transformed personal taste into collective standard. She also understood ritual as a language of power. Her events were choreographed without ever appearing theatrical. Everything seemed effortless, even though nothing was left to chance. Guests sensed that they were participating in something larger than themselves, something ordered, something quietly exclusive. Men governed institutions. Caroline Astor governed atmosphere. And atmosphere shaped destinies. Marriages were influenced by who shared rooms and conversations. Reputations formed not through scandal, but through proximity. Respect was absorbed simply by being in the right place, among the right people, at the right time. To exist outside that circle, even with immense wealth, was to remain perpetually provisional. What made her authority so difficult to confront was that it had no official form. There was no title to challenge, no position to replace. Newspapers hinted at her influence, but never formalized it. Society columns reinforced it without questioning it. Her role existed in the collective behavior of others, not in her own declarations. That invisibility was not a flaw. It was protection. Caroline Astor benefited from a rare historical moment. Old structures had not yet collapsed, but new ones were already straining against them. The old elite needed someone to anchor tradition. The new elite needed someone to legitimize them. For different reasons, both sides accepted her judgment. She did not need to dominate. She needed only to remain central. By positioning herself as the quiet reference point, she allowed society to organize itself around her preferences. Over time, what she approved came to feel inherently respectable. What she ignored became suspect. And because this logic was never formally stated, it became deeply internalized. This was not coercion. It was consent, shaped by fear of exclusion and hunger for belonging. Caroline Astor never passed laws, but she enforced rules more enduring than legislation. Rules about who mattered, who counted, who would be remembered as refined rather than merely rich. By the time her influence was widely acknowledged, it no longer required defense. Society had already accepted her as its silent judge. And without claiming authority, without demanding obedience, she had become something extraordinarily rare in history, a woman whose quiet decisions shaped an entire social order. In the next part, we will see how this invisible authority crystallized into a single, unforgettable symbol, one that reduced power to a number, a list, and a door that could either open or remain closed. The idea of the 400 did not begin as an announcement. There was no proclamation, no published decree, no official ledger nailed to a door. Like all the most powerful mechanisms of social control, it emerged quietly, almost casually, until it became unavoidable. By the late 19th century, New York society was drowning in wealth. The city was packed with men who could build palaces, import art from Europe, and outspend entire aristocracies. But money, for all its force, created chaos. Too many hosts, too many balls, too many people claiming importance. And beneath the glitter ran a persistent anxiety. If everyone could afford luxury, how would anyone know who truly mattered? That question demanded an answer. It found one in a number. 400. At first, it sounded almost practical. Observers noted that Mrs. Astor's ballroom could comfortably hold about 400 guests. No more, no less. A physical limit, nothing more. Or so it seemed. But within that limitation lay a devastating idea. If only 400 people could fit, then only 400 people could truly belong. Everything else followed from that assumption. The 400 was never formally written down by Caroline Astor herself. That distinction is important. She did not claim authorship, which meant she could not be openly challenged. Instead, the concept circulated through society columns, whispered conversations, and knowing glances. People repeated it because it explained something they already felt, that there was a line, and most people were standing on the wrong side of it. Once the idea took hold, it hardened into reality. Being part of the 400 was not about wealth alone. Many of the richest individuals in America found themselves excluded. Instead, it was about recognition, by the right people, in the right rooms, at the right time. To be inside the 400 meant you were no longer merely successful, you were legitimate. And legitimacy, once established, became self-reinforcing. Invitations followed invitations. Introductions multiplied. Names appeared again and again in the same social circles, until familiarity became proof of worth. The 400 began to feel less like a list and more like a natural order of things. Of course they were included. Of course others were not. For women especially, this boundary carried immense weight. Marriage prospects shifted dramatically based on whether a family was perceived as in. A young woman from a newly wealthy household might be impeccably dressed, educated and charming, but if her family had not crossed the invisible threshold, her social future remained uncertain. Doors that mattered most did not open easily, and sometimes did not open at all. The cruelty of the system lay in its precision. There was no partial inclusion. You were either counted or you were not. There was no appeal process, no explanation, no opportunity to argue your case. Silence served as the verdict, and silence was relentless. What made the 400 so powerful was not merely who it included, but how it excluded. Being left out was not a public humiliation. It was worse. It was ambiguity. Families could spend years unsure whether they were on the brink of acceptance or permanently dismissed. That uncertainty kept them compliant, observant, and cautious. They adjusted their behavior, their dress, their speech, their manners. They learned restraint where they once practiced display. Excess, ironically, became a liability. Too much ambition revealed desperation. Too much wealth revealed insecurity. The 400 rewarded composure, not spectacle. This was not accidental. The number itself became symbolic, almost sacred. 400 was not just a capacity limit, it was a ritual boundary. It transformed a private architectural detail into a public moral standard. The ballroom became a gate. The guest list became a judgment. And judgments, once ritualized, feel inevitable. What is often overlooked is how emotionally charged this system was, especially for women. Social acceptance was not merely about parties, it determined one's entire sense of belonging. To be included was to feel seen, validated, and secure. To be excluded was to exist in a permanent state of social probation. For women who had little access to formal power, this mattered intensely. Their futures depended on social networks. Their reputations were fragile. Their mobility, both social and marital, was constrained by perception. The 400 did not simply classify people, it shaped lives. Men could retreat into business after a social slight. Women could not. And yet, the system was upheld largely by women themselves. Elite women policed the boundaries with remarkable discipline. They observed who attended which events. They noted absences. They adjusted their own invitations accordingly. In doing so, they became participants in a collective enforcement mechanism that required no central authority. Caroline Astor did not need to intervene constantly. Society internalized her standard and reproduced it willingly. That is the true brilliance and danger of the 400. It functioned because people believed in it. No one needed proof. The absence of proof was part of the power. If your name did not appear where you hoped it would, the implication was clear enough. If you were not invited, you were not invited. Asking why only confirmed that you did not belong. And so the system protected itself. Over time, being part of the 400 became synonymous with being correct. Correct manners, correct lineage, correct restraint. The list did not simply reflect society, it defined it. Those outside were not merely excluded, they were subtly framed as lacking something essential, even if no one could say exactly what. This vagueness was intentional. It allowed the boundary to shift without explanation. New families could be admitted slowly, selectively, when they demonstrated sufficient conformity. Others remained perpetually adjacent, wealthy, visible, but never quite embraced. The 400 remained small not because space was limited, but because scarcity preserved value. In this way, the number controlled aspiration itself. People did not merely want to be rich, they wanted to be counted. And the most striking aspect of all was how calmly it was accepted. There were complaints, of course, satire, resentment, but no revolution, no rejection of the system as unjust. Instead, there was accommodation, adjustment, endurance. The 400 offered something many people secretly craved: clarity. In a world of rapid change, it told people where they stood. Even if the answer was painful, it was definitive. And once definitive, it shaped behavior more effectively than any explicit rule. Caroline Astor rarely needed to reference the 400 directly. The idea lived independently of her voice. That distance preserved her dignity and protected her authority. She did not appear to judge, she simply appeared to host. But hosting, in this context, was an act of power. By limiting space, she limited recognition. By limiting recognition, she defined reality. And by never explaining herself, She allowed the system to appear natural rather than constructed. The 400 was not about snobbery alone. It was about control, quiet, elegant, and devastatingly effective. It transformed a social gathering into a measuring instrument. It reduced human worth, in elite circles, to presence or absence, inside or outside, counted or ignored. And once that logic took hold, it shaped New York society for decades. In the next part, we will look at how this system was enforced not through confrontation, but through something far more powerful and far more terrifying to those who depended on belonging: silence itself. Caroline Astor never needed to say no out loud. In fact, the most striking feature of her authority was how rarely she spoke at all. There were no public refusals, no sharp rebukes, no scenes of confrontation. She did not argue, she did not justify, she did not explain. And yet, families trembled at the possibility of her silence. This was the true architecture of her power. In the Gilded Age, society expected spectacle. Wealth was noisy. Ambition was visible. Men announced themselves through buildings, newspapers, and numbers. Against that backdrop, Caroline Astor's restraint was disarming. While others competed for attention, she withdrew it. While others tried to impress, she waited. Her authority was not enforced through action, but through absence. And absence, in elite society, was devastating. Caroline Astor understood something fundamental about human behavior. People fear exclusion more than punishment. Punishment at least acknowledges your existence. Exclusion denies it. It suggests that you are not worth responding to, not worth opposing, not even worth rejecting. When a family failed to receive an invitation from her, there was no explanation to contest, nothing to argue against, no rule to challenge. There was only a quiet realization that something essential had not happened. And that realization lingered. A single omission could undo years of careful social climbing. A household might have hosted lavish dinners, cultivated connections, dressed impeccably, followed every visible rule. Yet one season would pass, then another, and still the invitation did not arrive. No message was sent, no offense named. The silence itself became the verdict. What made this power so effective was its ambiguity. Was the exclusion temporary, a misunderstanding, a test, or was it permanent? No one could be sure. That uncertainty kept families cautious, restrained, endlessly self-correcting. They replayed conversations, they scrutinized behavior, they softened their voices, they reduced excess, they waited. Silence kept them obedient. In a legal system, punishment is explicit. You know what you are accused of, you know the consequence. In Caroline Astor's social order, nothing was explicit, and because nothing was explicit, everything was personal. The lack of explanation forced people to assume fault. Someone must have misstepped, someone must have offended, someone must not yet be worthy. That internalization of blame was the mechanism. Caroline Astor never needed to declare standards because society worked tirelessly to guess them. People observed her reactions, or lack of reaction, with obsessive care. They noted who she acknowledged in conversation, who she greeted warmly, who received a nod, and who received nothing at all. These signals were subtle, but in elite circles, subtlety was the language of power. To be ignored by her was not dramatic, it was worse. It was quiet. And quiet carried consequences. Social isolation followed swiftly. Other hostesses adjusted their guest lists, Invitations elsewhere began to thin. Conversations cooled. A family might still appear wealthy, still visible, but something had shifted. Their presence felt provisional, conditional. They existed on the edge of legitimacy, unsure whether they would ever cross fully into acceptance. This was not coordinated punishment, it was social gravity. Once silence marked a family, others instinctively stepped back. No one wanted to risk association with someone who might be unacceptable. Silence spread outward, reinforcing itself. And because no one ever named the cause, no one could openly resist it. This form of power was especially potent for women. In the Gilded Age, a woman's future was tightly bound to her social standing. Marriage prospects, friendships, reputation, all depended on perception. Men could absorb social slights and retreat into business. Women could not. Their world was smaller, more intimate, and more vulnerable to exclusion. A young woman whose family was quietly sidelined found her prospects narrowing. Introductions slowed. Invitations became rarer. Suitors hesitated, not because she lacked beauty or intelligence, but because uncertainty had attached itself to her name. Silence had created doubt, and doubt was fatal. Caroline Astor understood this dynamic intimately. She did not weaponize cruelty, she weaponized uncertainty. By refusing to explain herself, she denied others the ability to adapt strategically. They could not correct what they could not identify. They could only wait, and waiting placed all power in her hands. This is what distinguished her influence from open domination. She did not need to be feared in the traditional sense. She needed to be unreadable. Unreadability creates discipline. Those who wished to belong learned to minimize risk. They avoided controversy. They moderated opinions. They followed precedent. They aligned themselves with what seemed safe, acceptable, established. Innovation was dangerous. Excess was dangerous. Individuality in the wrong form was dangerous. Silence rewarded conformity. This was the Gilded Age version of control. Not enforced by police or courts, but by drawing rooms and dinner tables. Not codified in law, but absorbed through repetition. It trained behavior without issuing commands. And because it appeared voluntary, it was remarkably stable. Caroline Astor rarely intervened directly because she did not have to. Society anticipated her judgment and adjusted in advance. The fear of exclusion did more work than exclusion itself. Families disciplined themselves, hoping to avoid her silence. In that sense, her power extended far beyond the moments she acted. It filled the space where action might have been. There were, of course, those who resented her influence. Satire appeared in newspapers. Complaints circulated in private. But resentment did not translate into rebellion. Why? Because no one could point to a single act of injustice. There was no declaration to protest, no rule to overturn. Only a pattern of absence. And patterns are difficult to confront. What made this system so enduring was its dignity. Caroline Astor never appeared vindictive. She never appeared angry. She never appeared to punish. She simply appeared to continue as she always had. That continuity gave her silence legitimacy. It felt less like exclusion and more like inevitability, as though the world itself had decided. This is why her power survived scrutiny. It did not look like power. It looked like taste, like preference, like personal comfort. And those things, especially when held by women, were rarely challenged as political forces. even when they clearly were. In truth, Caroline Astor governed through non-action. She demonstrated that doing nothing, in the right position, could be more destructive than doing something loudly. A single unreturned gesture could dismantle ambition. A single ignored presence could erase years of effort. This was not the power of the state. It was the power of belonging. And in a society where belonging determined everything, from marriage to memory, that power was absolute. By the time people recognized the danger of her silence, it was too late to escape it. The rules had already been internalized. The fear had already done its work. The system no longer required enforcement. Silence had become law. In the next part, we will examine how this quiet authority shaped not only who was included, but how women themselves became the enforcers of a system that both empowered and confined them, turning social ritual into a mechanism of control that outlived Caroline Astor herself. The conflict between old money and new money was not merely about wealth. It was about legitimacy, memory, and fear. In the Gilded Age, money arrived faster than identity could form around it. Fortunes were built in a single generation, sometimes in a single decade. Railroads cut across the continent, steel reshaped cities, oil rewrote the scale of profit. Men who had once been anonymous suddenly possessed more money than families who had defined New York society for generations. But money alone did not confer belonging. Old money families understood this instinctively. Their power did not rest on how much they owned, but on how long they had been recognized. Lineage mattered. Familiarity mattered. The right accent, the right restraint, the right silence mattered. Their wealth was expected to behave quietly, almost apologetically, as if abundance were something to be managed rather than displayed. New money behaved differently. It arrived loudly. It built bigger houses, hosted grander events, and spent without hesitation. Its owners had learned to assert themselves in business, and they brought that confidence into social life. They assumed that success entitled them to acceptance, and in doing so, they collided with a world that measured worth by entirely different rules. This collision created tension everywhere. Old families watched nervously as their financial dominance slipped, even as they clung to social authority. New families felt insulted by exclusion they did not understand. Both sides needed something the other possessed. Old money needed capital to maintain relevance. New money needed legitimacy to feel complete. Into this uneasy space stepped Caroline Astor. She did not invent the divide, but she mastered it. More importantly, she positioned herself as the one person capable of managing the crossing between the two worlds. She became the gatekeeper, not by force, but by trust. Old families trusted her to protect tradition. New families trusted her to signal when acceptance was possible, and she never rushed either side. Caroline Astor understood that the conflict could not be resolved by simple inclusion or rejection. Too much openness would dissolve the meaning of old society. Too much rigidity would isolate it completely. Her power lay in selective permeability. She allowed movement, but only under conditions she controlled. To new money families, this process felt like a test. They were observed closely, not for how much they spent, but for how they behaved. Did they display restraint? Did they understand when not to speak? Did they treat wealth as entitlement or as responsibility? Excessive display was read as insecurity. Aggressive ambition was read as vulgarity. The irony was cruel. The very qualities that had made these families successful in business, assertiveness, expansion, visibility, became liabilities in society. Old money families, by contrast, were judged on consistency. Their continued inclusion was not guaranteed, but it was assumed. They did not need to prove themselves constantly. Their legitimacy was inherited, reinforced by repetition and memory. Their presence felt natural because it had always been there. Caroline Astor guarded that sense of naturalness fiercely. She did not block new money entirely. That would have been unrealistic and ultimately self-defeating. Instead, she controlled the pace. Admission came slowly, selectively, often after years of careful observation. Some families were gradually washed of their rawness through proximity, marriage, and behavioral adjustment. Others never made it through at all. This process was often described, quietly, as a form of social baptism. To be accepted by Caroline Astor was to be cleansed of the suspicion attached to sudden wealth. It signaled that a family had learned the language of restraint, that they could be trusted not to disrupt the fragile balance of elite society, that their money would not embarrass the room. Those who passed this test were transformed. They were no longer described as merely rich. They became respectable. Their daughters were considered suitable. Their sons were welcomed. Their names began to appear alongside established families, not as curiosities, but as peers. Over time, the distinction between old and new blurred, but only after Caroline Astor had sanctioned it. Those who failed faced a different fate. They remained wealthy, visible, sometimes even admired, but never quite embraced. They could host spectacular events, but the wrong people would attend. They could build mansions, but those houses would feel socially empty. They lived in a permanent state of proximity, without inclusion. Rich, but not refined. Successful, but not legitimate. This distinction mattered deeply, especially to women. For women, social standing was not an accessory to life. It was the framework of it. Their friendships, marriages, reputations, and sense of security depended on it. Being part of the right circle offered protection and continuity. Being excluded meant vulnerability and uncertainty. Women from new money families felt this pressure acutely. They were often educated, cultured, and eager to belong. Yet their efforts could be undermined by something as small as a misjudged display or an association deemed inappropriate. Their futures hinged on decisions made quietly elsewhere. Caroline Astor did not need to reject them openly. She simply delayed recognition. Delay, in this context, was decisive. Years could pass without clear answers. Was acceptance coming? Had a mistake been made? Should behavior change? This uncertainty disciplined ambition more effectively than any outright refusal. Families adjusted themselves in hopes of eventual approval. In doing so, they reinforced Caroline Astor's authority without her needing to assert it. Old money families, meanwhile, found reassurance in her judgment. She acted as a buffer between them and the unsettling speed of social change. By controlling admission, she preserved the illusion that tradition still governed society, even as economic reality shifted beneath it. This balancing act was delicate and relentless. Caroline Astor did not favor old money simply because it was old. She favored stability, predictability. the preservation of an order that made sense to those who already belonged. New money threatened that order not by existing, but by moving too fast. Her solution was not resistance, but regulation. In doing so, she shaped the social hierarchy of an entire era. She determined which fortunes would fade quietly into respectability and which would remain perpetually conspicuous. She decided which names would blend into history and which would always sound slightly out of place. The conflict between old money and new money did not end with resolution. It ended with absorption, on her terms. And those terms were never written down. They lived in invitations and omissions, in proximity and distance, in the subtle choreography of social life. Caroline Astor stood at the center of that choreography, not as a tyrant, but as a quiet conductor. She did not stop change, she filtered it. And in doing so, she ensured that wealth alone would never be enough. In the world Caroline Astor presided over, a dinner was never just a dinner. A ball was never merely an evening of music and movement. And a reception was certainly not an act of casual hospitality. These gatherings were instruments, carefully calibrated tools through which power was exercised, alliances were forged, and entire social futures were decided without a single word being spoken aloud. To understand this, one must abandon the modern idea of a party as entertainment. In Gilded Age New York, social events were closer to political assemblies than leisure. They followed strict protocols, invisible hierarchies, and deeply understood consequences. Every invitation carried meaning. Every seating arrangement communicated rank. Every absence was noted. Caroline Astor understood this better than anyone. Her balls and dinners were rituals of recognition. They did not merely reflect social order, they created it. To be invited into her home was to be acknowledged as legitimate. To cross her threshold was to enter a space where status was affirmed, reinforced, and observed by the very people whose opinions mattered most. These events functioned as ceremonies of inclusion. Guests did not attend simply to enjoy themselves. They attended to be seen, by the right eyes, in the right context. Presence itself was performative. One's attire, posture, conversation, even one's restraint became signals that were read and remembered. A successful evening could elevate a family's standing subtly, but permanently. A misstep could stall progress for years. And for women, the stakes were especially high. Marriage was not simply romantic, it was strategic. Balls and dinners were the primary arenas where suitable alliances could form. Introductions were not random, they were deliberate. Who stood near whom? Who danced together? Who was seated side by side at dinner? These choices shaped possibility. A young woman introduced at the right moment, in the right room, to the right family, could see her future shift quietly into place. A young woman excluded from these spaces might never encounter those opportunities at all. No rejection was spoken. The absence itself did the work. In this way, Caroline Astor's gatherings operated as matchmaking engines, but only for those deemed worthy of consideration. Marriage alliances reinforced social cohesion within the elite, ensuring that wealth, lineage, and legitimacy circulated among the same families. Outsiders were not banned outright, they were simply not present. Reputation, too, was constructed within these rooms. To be consistently invited signaled reliability, acceptance, and trust. It meant that one was safe to associate with, that one would not embarrass the room. Over time, repeated presence hardened into reputation. A family known to attend the right events became known as the right kind of family. Conversely, absence carried its own message. When invitations stopped arriving, or never arrived at all, others noticed. Social calendars compared notes silently. Who had been seen last season, but not this one? Who hosted extravagantly, but was never reciprocated? These patterns were read with precision, and once absence became visible, it spread. This was not coordinated exclusion. It was collective inference. No one wanted to align themselves with uncertainty. If Caroline Astor did not extend recognition, others hesitated to do so independently. The result was social erasure without confrontation. A family could exist financially, even prominently, while slowly disappearing from meaningful social circulation. The brilliance of this system lay in its civility. There were no public humiliations, no denouncements, no scenes. Everything appeared graceful, polite, even generous. Caroline Astor did not punish, she curated. And curation, when performed by someone universally accepted as authoritative, becomes law without legislation. These gatherings also functioned as places where alliances between families were quietly reinforced. Shared attendance signaled mutual acceptance. Repeated proximity created familiarity, and familiarity created trust. Business interests often followed social bonds, though never openly acknowledged as such. Economic and social power intertwined subtly, each strengthening the other. Men might negotiate contracts elsewhere, but the groundwork for cooperation was often laid in drawing rooms and ballrooms, under the supervision of women who understood how influence flowed. For Caroline Astor, control did not come from dominance, but from orchestration. She decided the size of the gathering, the tone of the evening, the composition of the guest list. Scarcity was essential. The fewer the invitations, the greater their value. To attend was to be chosen, and being chosen mattered. The physical structure of these events reinforced hierarchy. Large ballrooms allowed for visibility and distance. Smaller dinners allowed for intimacy and evaluation. Receptions created opportunities for observation without commitment. Each format served a purpose. Each filtered participants differently. Nothing was accidental. Even the rhythm of the social season played a role. To be invited early in the season signaled confidence. To be invited late suggested probation. To be omitted entirely was to be left in uncertainty. Time itself became a tool. Women learned to read these cues instinctively. They knew when they were advancing and when they were stalling. They adjusted accordingly, changing behavior, refining presentation, moderating ambition. Social life became a continuous process of calibration. And Caroline Astor stood at the center of it all. She did not need to instruct others explicitly. Her choices set patterns that others followed. By attending her events, guests affirmed her authority. By aspiring to attend them, outsiders reinforced it. The system fed on desire. In this way, balls, dinners, and receptions became something far more consequential than entertainment. They were the infrastructure of elite society. They regulated access. They distributed opportunity. They validated identity. To be invited was to exist. To be excluded was not dramatic, but it was final. Families who fell outside this system did not simply lose social pleasures, they lost relevance. Their daughters married elsewhere, if at all. Their names faded from the inner circles that defined influence. They became footnotes in a world that remembered only those who had been present. And all of this occurred without protest, without legislation, without overt force. This was politics without ballots, power without offices, authority exercised through etiquette and silence. Caroline Astor did not need to rule openly because her gatherings ruled for her. They transformed hospitality into governance and leisure into law. In the Gilded Age, where everything seemed gilded but nothing felt secure, these rituals offered certainty at the cost of exclusion. And for those who understood what was truly at stake, every invitation was more than an evening out. It was a verdict. In the Gilded Age, women were officially powerless. They could not vote. They could not hold office. They could not openly shape law, policy, or institutions. History books often present this absence as silence, as if women simply stood outside the machinery of power. But that interpretation misses something essential. Power does not disappear simply because it is denied formal recognition. It changes shape. And in the social world of late 19th century America, women learned to exercise authority indirectly, quietly, persistently, and with extraordinary effect. No figure illustrates this more clearly than Caroline Astor. She never stood behind a podium. She never argued in public. She never claimed influence. And yet, she shaped the behavior of the most powerful men and women in New York society. Her authority did not challenge male dominance head-on. It moved around it, beneath it, and through it. This was not accidental. It was adaptive. In a world where men controlled visible power, women controlled the invisible structures that made that power socially usable. Wealth, ambition, and authority all required legitimacy. And legitimacy was social before it was political. It depended on reputation, recognition, and acceptance, domains that elite women quietly governed. Caroline Astor did not issue commands. She set standards. By controlling ritual, she controlled meaning. Who was invited? Who was acknowledged? Who was seated where? Who was introduced to whom? These details may appear trivial, but they determined whether a person felt secure or uncertain, respected or suspect. In elite society, such feelings were not private emotions. They were signals that shaped behavior. This was the genius of indirect power. It worked not by force, but by alignment. Women like Caroline Astor did not tell others what to do. They created environments in which certain behaviors were rewarded and others were discouraged. Over time, people adjusted themselves voluntarily. Men moderated their conduct. Families disciplined their display. Ambition learned restraint. All without a single public confrontation. This form of authority was especially potent because it appeared non-threatening. Male power in the Gilded Age relied on confrontation, competition, and visibility. Female power relied on continuity, repetition, and subtlety. It operated through habits rather than declarations. And because it did not look like power, it was rarely challenged as such. Elite women understood that speaking openly could weaken them. Silence protected them. Silence preserved ambiguity. Ambiguity allowed influence to expand without resistance. Caroline Astor never argued about who belonged. She simply behaved as if the answer were obvious. Others followed her lead, not because they were ordered to, but because they trusted her judgment, or feared the consequences of ignoring it. In this way, women became custodians of social order. They maintained standards of behavior that men depended on but rarely acknowledged. They regulated access to spaces where alliances formed. They mediated reputation. They decided what was appropriate, tasteful, and respectable. These decisions shaped marriage markets, business relationships, and long-term social mobility. For women listening to this story today, the familiarity may feel unsettling. This was influence exercised without credit, authority without recognition, labor without acknowledgement. Women upheld systems that benefited men while remaining excluded from formal power themselves. And yet, within those constraints, they carved out spaces of real control. Caroline Astor's influence did not challenge patriarchy directly, but it constrained it. Men could accumulate wealth, but they still needed acceptance. They could command industries, but they could not easily command respect. That respect was mediated by women who understood how fragile legitimacy truly was. This indirect power also created a paradox. By enforcing strict social codes, elite women gained authority, but they also reinforced the very structures that limited them. They became gatekeepers of an order that excluded others and confined themselves. Their influence depended on silence, composure, and self-restraint. To appear emotional, outspoken, or overtly ambitious would undermine the very authority they wielded. Power came at the cost of visibility. Caroline Astor mastered this balance. She was present everywhere, yet rarely foregrounded. She shaped outcomes without appearing to seek them. Her success lay in her ability to make her preferences feel like tradition rather than opinion. This is why her authority endured. When women operate through indirect power, change is slow but deep. It embeds itself in expectation rather than enforcement. It teaches people how to behave without telling them why. And once internalized, it becomes difficult to dismantle. The Gilded Age was filled with powerful men, but it was stabilized by powerful women. Their names appear less frequently in official records, but their influence structured daily life. They determined who felt secure, who felt anxious, who felt included, and who remained perpetually uncertain. Caroline Astor did not represent rebellion. She represented adaptation. She demonstrated how women navigated exclusion by mastering the spaces left to them, and then expanding those spaces quietly. Her story challenges the idea that power must always be loud to be real. It also asks a more uncomfortable question. How often has history mistaken silence for absence? Women like Caroline Astor did not stand outside power. They stood beside it, beneath it, and sometimes directly behind it, shaping outcomes while allowing others to believe they were in control. This is why her legacy matters. Not because she was kind or cruel, not because she was generous or exclusionary, but because she reveals how authority survives when it is denied formal expression. How women learned to rule without appearing to rule. And how entire social systems can be governed through ritual, restraint, and the quiet management of belonging. In the Gilded Age, women did not write the laws, but they taught society how to obey. When Caroline Astor died, nothing dramatic happened at first. There was no announcement that an era had ended, no declaration that power had shifted hands. Society continued to gather, to dine, to host, but something essential was already dissolving. The authority that had once been concentrated, quietly, almost invisibly, in a single woman, did not transfer. It dispersed. And once dispersed, it could never be reassembled. Caroline Astor's power depended on rarity,
on a shared agreement that recognition flowed through one center. That agreement did not survive her. Without her presence, there was no single figure whose silence could still a room, whose invitation could confer legitimacy beyond question. What followed was not chaos, but dilution. The gates did not slam open. They simply stopped being guarded. In the years after her death, American society entered a new phase. Wealth no longer waited patiently for approval. It announced itself. Newspapers expanded their reach, society columns multiplied, photographs replaced whispers. Visibility became currency. Being seen mattered more than being selected. The mechanisms of social control changed accordingly. Where Caroline Astor once defined status through absence, the new era defined it through exposure. Publicity replaced discretion. Fame replaced recognition. A name printed often enough could substitute for lineage. A product, a brand, a headline could now confer social relevance. This shift favored men and markets. Industrialists no longer needed permission to be noticed. Their wealth spoke for itself, amplified by mass media. Lavish displays, once a liability, became a strategy. The quiet codes of restraint lost their authority as spectacle gained power. The ballroom gave way to the press page. For women, this transformation was double-edged. On one hand, the collapse of a centralized social hierarchy loosened constraints. Fewer doors were permanently closed. Fewer judgments were final. The rigid rituals that had confined women's futures began to soften. On the other hand, the informal authority women had wielded evaporated with the system that sustained it. The power to decide, quietly and absolutely, disappeared. No longer could one woman shape the social fate of hundreds of families through invitation alone. Influence fragmented among editors, advertisers, tastemakers, and eventually celebrities. Authority became louder, faster, and far less stable. What mattered one season could vanish the next. This instability marked the end of an era. The Gilded Age had relied on illusion, on the belief that order existed beneath excess. Caroline Astor embodied that illusion. She made society feel governed, even as it raced toward modernity. Once she was gone, the illusion faded. What remained was visibility without hierarchy, recognition without ritual. And with that, something was lost. Not fairness, not equality, but coherence. There would never again be a moment when a single woman, operating without title or office, could determine who belonged simply by opening or closing her doors. Power had become too diffuse, too public, too dependent on attention rather than acceptance. History often celebrates progress without mourning what disappears along the way. But the end of Caroline Astor's influence reveals a truth that is rarely acknowledged. Some forms of power vanish not because they were unjust, but because the world that sustained them no longer exists. Her legacy is not a list or a number. It is a reminder that authority does not always need institutions, that silence can govern as effectively as law, and that there was once a moment in American history when the fate of families rested not in newspapers or markets, but in a single, unspoken invitation. That moment has passed, and it will never return. History rarely announces when power disappears. It simply grows quiet, then changes shape. What we have explored today was not spectacle, not myth and not invention, but a real system of influence that once ruled without laws, armies, or titles. On Veiled Queens, we do not dramatize history. We examine the silences it left behind and the power hidden inside them. If stories like this help you see the past more clearly, we invite you to subscribe to Veiled Queens. Here, we uncover how authority truly worked, especially where history chose not to look. Thank you for watching, and we will meet again behind the veil.